podcast. See what's on your mind. It's the Treatable podcast. Real, coming, Treatable. It's the Treatable podcast. It's all on the Treatable podcast.
There is one mental health challenge that people just love to hate. Those who suffer from it are often described as insufferable. These people are always right, and they seem to have a unique talent of making everything about them. Yes, we are talking about narcissism, but what actually makes a person a narcissist? As I learned in today's conversation, the things that create and define narcissists may surprise you. Welcome to Treatable, the podcast that explores mental health challenges with experts who show us that change is possible. I'm your host, Clint Mally, and each week we invite you to join us as we explore a unique mental health challenge, learn how to navigate it, and discuss treatments that actually work. Today, we're breaking down the complex topic of narcissism with expert guest Darren Elliott. Darren is an experienced coach, educator, speaker, and psychotherapist qualifying. He specializes in helping people suffering from narcissistic personality disorder recover, and has joined us today to help us understand how narcissism forms, how it shows up in relationships and behaviors, and most importantly, how it can be healed.
Treatable podcast. It's all on the Treatable podcast.
Welcome, Darren.
Thank you so much, Clint. It's an honor for me to be here. I love sharing about this topic.
So let's set the stage. When we're talking about narcissism, which has actually become kind of a hot button word today, what are we talking about?
So the term narcissism, as you know, it's being thrown around a lot. But essentially, the main trait of someone suffering from narcissism is that they are not feeling with others. That is the main thing that causes all the other defense mechanisms to come into play. They are not feeling with others. If they're not co-regulating their emotions with others. And by that, I mean, if you went up to them and with your sadness, it's like, oh, I'm feeling so sad. They wouldn't probably be able to see your sadness, feel your sadness, and go into your feeling of sadness. Like, oh, I'm sorry you're sad. What's going on for you? They would more likely experience your sadness as like, oh God, why are you coming to me with your sadness? Like, because they avoid negative emotions. They've for whatever reason, they've learned to avoid negative emotions. That is one of the main things. You can't do that. We all have nervous systems. You cannot avoid your emotions. Sensitivity differs between people. Some people are more sensitive and less sensitive in their emotions, and that is real. But everyone has some emotions. The problem with ignoring your negative emotions is that you end up ignoring emotions. You cannot selectively ignore your body feelings. But the other problem with that is if you are avoiding your negative emotions, you're not going there for yourself. You cannot go there with your wife or your partner or your brother either. And you don't realize, but that's actually disconnection. That's actually lack of empathy. Empathy is feeling with others. Others come to you with their emotion and you join them in that emotion, feeling it with them, not understanding it, not necessarily, but feeling it. You're like, that is how we evolved as human beings, to express our emotion, feeling it with others, getting that care and empathy, and the energy leaves our body.
It's important to note here that since communication was essential to us working with other humans to survive as a species, when there is a breakdown in communication, meaning that we don't take the time to unpack how we feel or communicate how we feel to others, it creates a stress response in our body. This is why being misunderstood feels so bad. If this cycle of not communicating our feelings and feeling stress in our bodies is repeated over a long period of time, it can manifest in mental health challenges like depression and anxiety, and even autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis and fibromyalgia.
If we don't have that, the energy gets stuck in our bodies. In the case of narcissism, some of them were just trying to be the best person they could. And by being the best person they could, they avoided all the negative feelings. But those negative feelings that are still there, you can get triggered into those negative feelings because you end up having to split. So you're in your positive emotions of connection, love, kindness, positive assumptions are happening here. This is an emotion they're able to co-regulate with. It's not dangerous. But if you say something that triggers shame for whatever reason, you look at them and it's not admiration, they can get triggered into their negative emotions. And now they're in these emotions of contempt and blame and anger and frustration and impatience. And they're doing one of two things. One, they're hiding it and they're pretending to still be here in cheerful land with you, but they're not. And that comes out as passive aggressive behaviors. It comes out as manipulations because they're now not they're not with you, but they're pretending to be with you. Or when they get triggered into that big energy, they might think it's your fault. And in that case, they will show it to you. And they will show it to you by allowing themselves to dysregulate. When you dysregulate, a lot of your brain shuts down. And then the abusive behavior comes out. All that disowned pain and anger and frustration that they are trying not to ends up getting targeted on the person who was there when it got triggered, and they think it's their fault.
For those of you who don't know, dysregulation here refers to nervous system dysregulation, which is an imbalance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. This is often caused by unresolved trauma, and nervous system dysregulation can disrupt how the brain processes and responds to information. It can present as emotional problems and cause a person to have intense reactions that are far out of proportion to the reality of the situation.
And they will say things like, "Look what you made me do." And for them, it's true. Whatever happened between the two of you, it pulled the trigger and it caused them to have an explosion. But they don't understand that was within them. They had the dynamite already in there. They accumulated too much negative emotion and now they can't deal with it. Because it's so much as well, they end up lacking awareness. Absolutely. They lack awareness of their impact, because if you're not feeling with others, you're not feeling the impact that you have on them either. You say something mean and it makes them feel sad. Well, you're not feeling with them, so you didn't really take it in. Didn't really mean much to you. So feeling with others is so important. And there's so many men right now who think they're not supposed to feel their feelings unless it's anger or happiness. You're like, no, you feel the whole gamut of feelings. You can't just choose the positive ones. You need to work through grief and anger and frustration. And honestly, it hasn't happened because there was a traumatized generation before us of men who had to disconnect from their emotions and their partners who were abused by them. A lot of men went off to war and came back with PTSD, came back with things that we didn't understand back then.
Let's do a little bit of a history lesson here. The term post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, became widely used in the 1970s, mainly due to Vietnam War veterans. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association officially recognized PTSD in its manual. This diagnosis, based on research with veterans, Holocaust survivors, and sexual trauma victims, helped link war trauma to civilian life. Initially controversial, it filled an important gap in psychiatry. Then in 1992, the World Health Organization also adopted the diagnosis. And though trauma has existed as long as bad things have been happening, large-scale wars and conflicts are the places where there is a huge uptick. Darren is pointing out here that when people aren't able to process the trauma that they've experienced, especially in war, they pass it on, often unknowingly, to their family.
But it looked like being disconnected from their emotions. It looked like having emotions they would get triggered into. It looked like drowning their emotions with alcohol. A lot of them became alcoholic. A lot of them were abusive towards their partners. That became the pattern. That was the only pattern the next generation saw. They saw that kind of father suffering PTSD, and then PTSD sort of became the emotional norm. And that looks a lot like narcissism. If PTSD is your trainer for your emotional system, because as kids, we're developing emotionally and we're growing emotionally. And we grow emotionally by expressing our emotions with others and feeling them. If you're not feeling them, even from the time of childhood, then your emotions, they're not going to mature. If you're not feeling your emotions, you're not going to grow up emotionally. You need to feel your emotions to grow up emotionally. That is the work that I do. When someone comes into me and they say, "Oh, my psychiatrist tells me I'm a narcissist. What can we do?" They need to grow up emotionally. They are stuck in childhood angry processes of gaslighting, saying what they want to believe true, thinking it's true, over-identifying with their thoughts, turning tables. They make it about the other, and then they believe themselves quite often. And this energy situation, they need to be able to release the negative energies in their life, but you can't release it if you never take accountability, if you never recognize it.
So this makes me think of a few different things, right? So first, I want to just make sure I'm hearing you right. When we think about empathy, it's really a problem with co-regulating, meaning that they're not able to empathize with others. They're not able to partake in the emotional experience of somebody else, especially when those emotions are related to negative or triggering emotions. For example, shame. So if somebody brings up something about myself that triggers the emotion shame, my coping mechanism could be to be passive aggressive and to mask how I feel, or it could be to blame or table turn, as you said. And so narcissism's actually a form of coping with emotions that they have not learned how to handle.
Absolutely. Narcissism is essentially relational trauma of disconnection. And we are meant to feel our connection with other humans. Traumatized people tend to traumatize others because they're living in a traumatized world where, for example, it's me versus you. If I think you're judging me first, I'm probably going to judge you first. If I think you're looking down at me, I might be like, oh, well, I might try to look down at you. In the case of narcissism, because they're not feeling with and they're not feeling their connection with, that separation, grandiosity ends up being the defense for some of them, for many of them. Because if I don't feel my inclusion, my belonging, they can recognize that people are having emotions around them that they're not sharing. They can recognize there's something different about me. I'm special. But they end up not connecting deeply with others due to their insecurities because they're not going deep, but that shallowness causes them to need to feel better than, because if I'm not a part and I don't need them anyway, I'm smarter than them anyway, I'll be okay without them anyway. This is the kind of childish processes that come up as a I'll be okay. It's okay. I don't need my mommy to come home at 6 o'clock. I'm smart enough anyway. I can do my homework by myself. That's being strong alone is what ends up creating narcissism. Essentially, narcissism lives in aloneness and separation and secrecy as well. If you learn not to share what's happening for yourself inside, and you keep that inside you, and no one actually knows what's happening inside you, we all need to be felt and seen. We all need to be understood. And if you're not able to share what's actually happening inside you, you're not being understood. And you are putting yourself on a desert island and you don't know it. You're putting yourself on a desert island with your innermost fears and thoughts and feelings. And that leaves reality. It's you put someone in solitary confinement, they lose their mind. It's just a horrible thing to do. We know it's inhumane, but people do it to themselves in the case of narcissism. And the more pain you feel, the more pain you're conveying onto others. So the amount of trauma that they experience themselves is generally the amount of trauma they're going to dish out. You don't hate someone if you think they're loving you,
This episode of Treatable is brought to you by Sandstone Care, which helps teens, young adults, and their families overcome challenges with mental health, substance use, and addiction. They provide age-specific, individualized treatment plans centered around your unique situation and goals, and they only use evidence-based therapies to help you get there. They keep their group therapy sizes small so folks can connect with others going through the same struggle and so that you never feel alone. They also give academic and vocational support to help you improve your grades or to get started on your career path. And lastly, because they know that mental health and substance use affect the people closest to us, they provide support for the whole family through their family therapy program. To learn more about teen and young adult treatment options, go to sandstonecare.com. Change is possible, and Sandstone Care is here to help. You're saying that narcissism often will stem back to early childhood experiences in which there was some sort of trauma. And in this case, it sounds a little bit like neglect, right? So oftentimes we think about trauma. If we unpack trauma, we have big T trauma, which is like a catastrophe or a one-time sexual abuse or something like that. But it can also be things like neglect,
Yeah.
right? Needing your parent and your parent is not there, or chronic trauma, which is often this little t trauma, which happens over a long period of time and just multiple times of a parent not being, not showing up. And so when a kid has to be strong alone because there's no one else to take care of them, they're going through something and they cannot rely on a parent to take care of them, then a way to deal with that is through narcissism. Is that right?
Right. Yes, it can be the defenses that you need to feel okay. And children have their emotional crises, and a lot of parents will reframe them as first world problems or nothing to cry about. But in the child's mind, when they're having a crisis, they're having a crisis. And the parent is, what they need is the parent to feel their crisis with them for a moment. Like if they're sad and crying, for the parent to feel sad, not because of the crisis. It's not a crisis. You feel sad with them because you see them feeling sad and you're in touch with your emotions and your emotions aren't a threat to you. So you feel sad with your kid for a minute, and that helps them to feel seen and understood, that feeling with them. It's more than just saying, I see you feel sad. What would make you feel better? It really is the necessity to be feeling with. A lot of parents didn't do that. And they didn't know to do that. But imagine if your mom was depressed when you were born, for example, and a little baby is learning how to co-regulate with a depressed woman. That's going to have an impact on your nervous system. And as a baby, that might be too much. Mom might have emotions that are just so painful that instead of co-regulating with her, we're going to disconnect.
To clarify for our listeners, co-regulation in early childhood is when children learn to manage their emotions and stress with the help of a parent or caregiver. Before a child can learn to self-soothe, they need a parent to help them. The hard part about co-regulation, though, is that an adult has to be able to regulate their own emotions in difficult moments before they can help children learn these same skills.
But what if mom was super anxious? Yeah, if mom's anxious and she's holding the baby will either co-regulate with her or learn to disconnect. Disconnection is narcissism. We need connection as humans, and if we don't have connection as humans, from early on, that the defenses start developing.
I think that this is a good point to think about when we talk about narcissism. This is an easy perspective to kind of beat up with people. People tend to not like narcissism. When we think about jobs that we've worked at or people that we've known, it's often the narcissists that get the biggest amount of flack. It's the narcissists that are the most under scrutiny because they come across as either overly confident or have a grandiose idea of themselves. And so it feels okay sometimes within our society to kind of beat these people up. But what you're saying is that oftentimes these types of feelings comes through a severe disconnection with your parents where the kid needed some sort of support and love and the parent wasn't there. And to your point, even if the parent doesn't see this problem as the big deal that the kid does, the worst thing that you've gone through is the worst thing that you've ever gone through. And it's relative to each and every person. Is that right?
Right. I mean, a kid has a fight at school and the friend says, I'm never talking to you again. That can feel like a total crisis. It can feel like your best friend is never going to talk to you again. Yeah, you come to the parent's like, oh, it's just a silly kid's fight. No, to that kid, he's upset. Validate their emotions. It's legit. Otherwise, you're teaching them not to feel their emotions, that their emotions don't have a purpose, that they're not helping. And we learn not to feel it. But you don't fully thrive when you're not feeling because you don't fully connect with others or yourself, in fact.
So narcissism is one way that people cope with this. What's another way that people would cope with this kind of childhood trauma or childhood challenges of disconnection. Because on the one hand, I could puff myself up. I could say, "Oh, like I'm I'm okay. I don't need anyone else. I can be isolated. I have to be strong alone." What's another direction that you'll see that people will go sometimes?
The more sensitive will tend to develop symptoms that are similar to ADHD because they learn to disconnect, they learn to turn off, they have an off valve. So they have an attention issue. Dysregulation can be a natural cause. If you're living in a narcissistic field, for example, in a field where you're not being seen and understood for the actual experience that you are having, that's what's going wrong for the kid. But sometimes it's even worse. Sometimes the kid is blamed for everything. So that can, if a kid's being blamed for everything, they take that message in, like this, I'm at fault, I'm at fault, I'm at fault, and that really hurts self-esteem. It really hurts their self-image, their self-concept, and it also hurts how they interpret the world around them, how safe even they feel in the world, and how they interpret the world. People, if you're constantly criticized by a parent, you probably it's fairly likely that you would feel like the world is a critical place and people are being critical with each other. That causes you to be critical as well when you think others are being critical. So another adaptation, as I said, sort of to learn to disconnect, but also the dysregulation. If someone is not understanding you in your emotions and you're a kid trying to be understood, your emotions will get bigger and then you'll give up. And then your emotions get bigger and you'll give up. You're really not being understood by a narcissist parent. You end up dysregulating. That looks like borderline.
What do you mean by dysregulating? What is dysregulating?
Dysregulating is when so much emotion comes up at one time that we can't deal with it, and it's just a state of heightened emotion overwhelm, and your nervous system is just on fire. And that happens with that's a borderline experience. And that can happen for a human if they're constantly misunderstood by the person who needs to understand them. If it's the person who connects them to the world most, like a narcissistic mother, that is a crisis for a child. No one is seeing and understanding my actual experience. If they're having it somewhere else, because it can happen with a favorite teacher, and that can be enough to give them that connection. It can happen with an aunt, a cousin, a neighbor. I have stories from clients who were sort of halfway stuck into narcissism, and it was a neighbor, who was kind and showed them that there's nice people out there, and they always had that little tie. But if someone was only in their family, and of course those first years are so important. The first years are so important for imprinting how we feel in the world and how much we trust others. And narcissists don't trust others, right? We need to trust others. We need to feel that someone has our back, that someone's on our side. If we truly feel like no one's on our side, we're going to act like no one's on our side, and that's what goes wrong.
So narcissism is a coping mechanism, just like we see alcohol or drugs or other types of addiction. It's a way that we can actually survive challenging circumstances. So if I'm in a relationship, especially as a kid with a caregiver relationship, and I'm getting critical feedback all the time, I'm not feeling connected to this person, they're not hearing where I'm coming from, I have one of two ways I can go. I can either supersede that and say, well, I am actually don't need them. Forget about that. I am above that. Or I can believe what they're saying about it. And I can dive deeper into, or I can shut those emotions off completely. And I can say, hey, this isn't something I want to feel at all. And so why are people narcissists? Because it works, because it helps them survive. Just like alcohol helps people control their emotions, narcissism helps people survive in the world. And have you seen that?
Well, yeah, that's so there's healthy narcissism and malignant narcissism. And it's important to know that we all have narcissism. It's not something that some people have, and it's not something that bad people have. Narcissism is well, Freud used the term to describe childhood processes. So he was describing how the child is self-absorbed, how they tend to think of themselves more than anything else, how the child thinks the world revolves around them and acts like such, and has a certain entitlement because they think the world revolves around them. Well, yeah, you come into the world with your little eyes and nose and ears, and this is all you know. Yeah, until you learn that you're just a small part of the world, you think that the world is yours. It's like, this is my little world, but mommy leaves the corner and it's like, mommy's gone. But these childhood processes get stuck with narcissism for whatever reason. So people end up not growing out of childhood processes, like believing in their own thoughts. They think the idea and then they think their thought is true. And they're like, and then the dragon came, and then the little dragon said to the princess, and they believe their thoughts are true. We eventually grow out of that. They also, and because of that causes gaslighting. But they also tend to say what they want to be true, which is gaslighting.
And for our listeners, gaslighting is another buzzword you've probably heard 100 times, but for those who don't know what it means, we've got you. Gaslighting is a type of manipulation in which a person causes another person to question and then doubt their own perception of reality. In this case, we're comparing it to when a child believes in their own imagination. But in adulthood, this can look like the intentional misrepresentation of reality and the forceful imposing of that false reality on others. Narcissists often use gaslighting to manipulate and then confuse the people closest to them. Another symptom of narcissism is having a polarized response. Darren, can you explain what that means?
Kids do have a polarized response. They learn the shades of gray over time. It's like, when mommy's good, it's like, good mommy. And when mommy's not doing what I like, bad mommy. Like they go to good and bad. And they can even say things like, I hate you. That's normal for kids. And kids need to be narcissistic. It's how we know who we are. A kid needs to be say, look, mommy, look. And they need to hear, oh, good job. You're looking good. Otherwise, they don't know they're looking good. They need a certain amount of validation. This is another way into it. In fact, if you were from a family that was taught validation is bad and you weren't validated, well, that might give you an addiction to validation because you weren't validated in the ways that you should have when you were growing up, to know that you were a good person, to have a healthy amount of narcissism, to know, a little bit of self-pride. Healthy narcissism is self-confidence, it's self-pride, knowing that you're good enough. Malignant narcissism is when you think you're better than others. It's that separation. And then that separation, the way you treat them. Malignant, when they go into negative energies, it can be, psychopathic, right? It can be really extremely damaging. And of course, narcissism has a bad rap because they do a lot of damaging things. If you're gaslighting and turning tables, like that's another thing, that they naturally will turn the tables to make it not my fault. And so at work, that will be happening possibly to coworkers, where they be trying to shift blame over here. Or if they're the boss, they will be trying to shift blame onto the person below them. And they expect others to make them feel good. And if you're not making them feel good, you get the off switch. So that that polarized, that's one of the processes they do not grow out of. So another process is the object constancy. That's the ability to remember two things are true at the same time. They're not able to do that. It's another childhood emotional process that got stuck. And it's when I'm fighting with you, I think you're against me. I forget that you're the person who loves me. I forget that we're married and we're actually on each other's team. And I absolutely forget that. I don't hold those things at the same time. For a person who's emotionally mature, we're able to feel our anger and at the same time hold, I'm really angry at you, and you're the person I love. So I know you don't deserve my abusive behavior because I know, in the end, you have my back. But for a narcissist, what's happening right now feels like everything that's happening, and they're mad at you, and they're going to think of every bad thing you ever did, or they're going to point out all the things that they can point out that are not good about you. They will, because they devalue, they go all the way. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that's malignant.
Yes, I see. Okay. So when you talked about this object permanence, it made me think about two different things. One is dialectical thinking, as you mentioned, being able to hold two things that are true at the same time. For example, I could say, I'm struggling with studying for this test, and if I continue to study, I have a greater chance of succeeding, right? That's the opposite of all or nothing thinking, which says, I'm struggling for this, studying for this test. I'm a terrible student, right? So this dialectical thinking allows us to be able to hold two things are true at the same time. And this also kind of contributes, and that's not a consistent trait within narcissists. They're not able to hold two things being true or opposing ideas at the same time. It's either all or nothing, right? So it's a cognitive distortion. It's a pattern of thinking that is consistent with them. And the second thing is the double down theory. And I love this because it's something that we have a lot of research on, especially when we think about cults, like end time cults, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about end time cults that say, hey, the world is going to end on April 7th. I just thought of, I'm such a narcissist, that's my birthday. April 7th, 2025. That's when the world is going to end. And then that time comes and the world doesn't end. Well, double down theory says that the people within that religious cult are going to do one of two things. They're either going to abandon completely their previously held beliefs, or they're going to double down and create a reason or a concept. Well, it's because of this event that happened this year that delayed it, or it's because it was a misrepresentation of what someone was trying to say. And so we see that this dialectical thinking or this doubling down, even in spite of logical evidence or things, are those consistent traits for narcissistic thinkers as well?
Yeah, because they're avoiding shame. They're avoiding any feeling of there's something wrong with me because it's too big. So if you're avoiding being wrong, and it feels like an absolute crisis for them to be wrong, so they are able to double down to not be wrong. I mean, they can actually learn to be wrong when it benefits it, and they can learn to admit being wrong. But inside, they might have a different dialogue going on as well.
Could you give some examples of, so I'm thinking about two people. I'm thinking about somebody who's wondering to themselves, am I a narcissist? Maybe. And I'm also thinking about somebody who might be in a relationship with one or know one or have a parent who's one. What are the key things to look out for when narcissism has become a coping mechanism that someone's using?
If you're feeling misunderstood a lot, it might be that you are being misunderstood a lot. Circular conversations where it doesn't get anywhere and you're not sure how it doesn't get anywhere. It happens because some of them are so good at gaslighting. You serve them a ball, they twist it before they send it back to you. And then you're like, well, no, that's not what I said. And then you try to say it and they twist it again. There's a communication error going wrong that often gets just sort of misunderstood as simply miscommunication. But in fact, they're not going there. I mean, they're not going to enter their negative emotions, so they're not going there with you. So they are not understanding, and that is real. The turning of tables, the automatic deflection of, they might go to, no, I didn't, you did, before they even think about what it was. That's because it's such a knee-jerk reaction, and then they won't let themselves think about it. They'll stop themselves from thinking about it. Now they're stuck. They're in that double down. They're literally able to not be facing the reality they just made a statement about, and they're able to, because they're so able to control what they're not feeling. They're also able to control what they're not thinking about in that degree. That's why awareness is so unlikely, right? Only 5% of narcissists actually wake up and get the help they need to grow up. But essentially, most people don't realize it's growing up is what they're doing. It's growing up from.
It's like emotional growth.
It's emotional growth that was stunted for whatever reason. But it's relational trauma. And it's disconnection causes a relational trauma, and survival mode causes the emotions to have not been supported enough to be felt and dealt with and processed and grown into new, more developed concepts like compassion and forgiveness and things like that. That's harder for them.
So if you're in a relationship whether it's a parent-child relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship, whether it's a friendship, and you have an inclination that this person might be using narcissism to cope with their childhood experiences that kind of led them to think the way that they think. How do you go about talking to this person? How do you go about supporting them? How do you go about like engaging a conversation that might be make one of those 5% where they actually get some help?
In the work I do, one of the main things is creating motivation for someone to want to grow. So I give them the motivation by sort of pointing out the reality of the relationships and how they are, which they will deny, but there's in a way recognizing it. So it's the awareness of their impact. You're not going to get them to change. You want them to reach for support. But if you can get them to connect meaningfully with others, if you can connect them to really trust, to develop the trust for someone, that's where it first happens. In the coaching, it happens by developing trust with the coach first. And that comes with them developing self-compassion. But that takes a therapist's skill to find where it went wrong for them to develop self-compassion. And then, because you can't feel compassion for others if you don't feel it for yourself. If you're not feeling it for yourself, you're just not feeling it. You can't feel something you don't feel. So that's where it starts. And then the way they judge themselves, in fact, is the way they generally judge others as well. Because they don't know they're a good person unless they have proof about it. So the proof can look like, being a volunteer, being on the board of deacons. Well, they love being at the head of a pulpit as well. In fact, they live in a me versus you mentality. But when they get into a group, they can get into an us versus them mentality. We the good ones and everyone else the evil ones. And that's a toxic belief as well. And that happens quite a lot. So and validation is so important. Their nervous system is essentially open and they need to be mirrored back in a positive way. And because of that, anything you mirror back that's not positive, like a suggestion or a request even, can sometimes make them feel like it's a criticism. They feel criticism huge. So that's where you would notice is that if you try to give them honest feedback, that it can sometimes cause a lot of defenses. That's not being able to acknowledge that they're imperfect. If someone cannot acknowledge that they're imperfect, that's a big, big clue. Because we're all imperfect and we're not supposed to be perfect. Our flaws are what make us unique, in fact. And our flaws are what we fall in love with. When there's a person on reality TV, it's the flaws that when they share that they had this happen, or they share that happened to them, or they share that they're really shy about this, or that they suffer social anxiety. That's where the connection happens with the viewer. We connect to each other's flaws. Narcissists think flaws are weakness, and they try to hide them. And so part of the work is letting those flaws come out. It's like, no, it's okay. You are not supposed to be perfect. None of us are. But for some reason, the sense of security is so weak, they have to be perfect or they're not good enough. And then in that case, there's different types of narcissists as well, right? If you're a janitor and you're a narcissist, you're not going to probably develop a grandiose sense of being. You might end up having the opposite and feel like everyone's against you, and need a lot of sympathy, in fact, and be talking a lot like, oh, poor me, this happened, and blame and contempt. It's everyone else's fault but mine. And that looks very, very different. People don't recognize that. The basement narcissist, someone who retreats into their own angry world. The trolls would often be a basement narcissist. They've retreated into their own world of one, and they're angry and alone.
I wanted to summarize some of the things I'm hearing you say. So when it comes to how does somebody who's suffering with narcissism go about changing, you brought up 3 really interesting points. The first is establishing a motivation to change. Why do you want to change? Is there something in your life right now that is not aligned with your goals? The second was self-compassion. because as you mentioned, you're not able to think about others' feelings if you're not able to first consider and even feel compassionate for your own feelings. And then the third step is actually connecting with others. So once I want to change, once I can connect with my own feelings and have compassion for myself, I can then learn how to connect with other people and be compassionate with them. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting that you pointed out was that when we think of narcissism, it's not always a grandiose confidence personality, but sometimes this narcissism can come around in an inner thinking of tragic, I've heard people in AA say tragic uniqueness, or where you think that no one has ever experienced the hardship, pain, challenges that you have. And because of that, that's another form of narcissism, because it's a different kind. It's not exuding confidence. It's actually exuding uniqueness. Is that right?
Yes. And I wanted to point out too, it's relationships is always the why. Because narcissism often rises people to the top of their organization. It often, we love the spotlight, and we like to be listened to. So we might study really hard to be an expert in our field, so that people are listening to us. So things might be going right in a lot of different ways, except relationships. That's where it's going wrong. But if you can get someone motivated that they want to have, the best, most loving, most kind relationships, once they understand that actually succeeding in life, at the end of life, studies show when you look back at your life, it's the relationships that matter the most. And they don't look back and say, I wish I worked more hours. And they don't say, sometimes they wish they learned golf, but the relationships are the biggest regret. I wish I spent more time with my mom. I wish I spent more time with my kids. I wish I'd loved them more. I wish I hadn't gone into anger so much. It kept us distant so many times. Relationships are what matter. And if they can come to understand, they don't feel like they matter to them because they don't have meaningful relationships. And once they learn that there's meaningful relationships out there that you are not having, they want that. Like, oh, I want that too. Because I explain to them, if you're not feeling your feelings, you're not feeling your deep feelings with others, you're not creating these deep relationships. And they're like, oh, I want to do that. Like, right? Because deep relationships are stable. They're supportive. If you don't lean on me, I can lean on you. We are supposed to lean on each other and make each other better. They just don't realize that, and they don't think that other people are living like that. So it's a challenge. I really get into this topic.
Yeah, no, I think it's really fascinating to think about narcissism as a connection problem. Alfred Adler, he was a pioneer. He was a contemporary of Freud. He coined individual psychology, which sounds a little narcissistic, but it's actually about improving relationships with people. And one of the things that he says is that all problems are really interpersonal problems, right? We see the problems, real problems, manifest in our relationship with each other. And that's because, as you mentioned earlier, we have grown as a human species to be able to survive with each other. When we were growing up as a species, we found that we could survive in groups. We could hunt in groups. There was safety in groups. There was stability in groups. And if I was outside of the tribe, if I wasn't a part of a group and I had to survive on my own, not only is my DNA going to die, but I'm also probably more likely to die from my environment. And so there's a tension within us that we know as a human being that we are designed to be in community with others, that we need others. And at the same time, if we feel disconnected from ourselves and we feel disconnected from others, and narcissism has kind of taken root in that we have to be able to first reconcile with ourselves in order to reconcile with others, because it's, to your point, how we actually find value and meaning within the world. Can I ask what made you actually interested in this topic? So there's a variety of topics within mental health that you could focus on, but narcissism is something that you feel really strongly about. Was there any experiences within your own life that made you think, hey, this is a common through line that I'm seeing within a lot of the people that I'm in treatment with, or that I'm or in therapy sessions? Why is this a focus for you?
This, narcissism is very much talked about today. So it's people have it on their radar as something that's going on in relationship issues. Most people have it a little bit confused about what narcissism means and what a narcissist looks like, but it's very much in front of us. When I was growing up, it was not in front of us. It was not a term that was understood at all, and I didn't wake up to this concept until I was middle-aged, pretty much. I Whatever you grow up in is normal for you generally. Most people will say, "Oh, how was your childhood?" "Oh, it was okay, average." Most people think they've had an average childhood. Even really, really terrible childhoods are often described as average, because you don't know that next door it's so completely different. You don't know that next door dad's not angry every single night, or you don't know that, next door, dad comes home after work and asks you, "How's your day?" Like, what? Really? Like, we don't know. We only know what's happening in our house. So I
Right.
didn't understand what had happened to me growing up like everyone else. Um, it's just normal for me. And I didn't see anything abnormal. Um, we had a tragedy in the family when I was a teenager. We had a few, and that clouded things as well and made things very fuzzy. But I had a relationship with someone um, who was constantly misunderstanding what I was saying, who was, I would I would say something and they would make it as if it was a negative when it wasn't a negative. It was either a neutral or just a communication. Um, Someone who, if I wasn't looking at them with admiration, they would start a fight. And I didn't understand what was happening, but they would literally be like, "I can see the way you're looking at me." And I was like, I don't know what they're talking about, but I was not allowed to have a bad mood. I wasn't allowed. I was in a relationship and I didn't understand what it was, but I was expected to make them feel good all the time. And if I wasn't making them feel good, they were abusive, or they were calling me abusive, in fact. And that was what the gaslighting that I wasn't able to believe was being called abusive when I knew I absolutely wasn't. Um, but I didn't know what this was until I was discarded. It was a very loving, I thought, very loving, romantic, connected, living together situation. And then we talked about buying a house in a different city. And it was just a light conversation that they introduced. And I was not interested in living this other city. And then we were done. And we were done like we were casual neighbors and I'll never see you again. Like, it was such a casual, now we're done and you're out of my life. It was just an off switch from 100 to 0. It ripped my guts out. I was I didn't understand what was happening, but I went to devalue. I went from being idealized to devalued, and trying to understand what was going on for me afterwards, because I just wasn't getting over it. And my family were saying, "Oh, it's just what a breakup's like. It's just normal, it's heartbreak." But then I started to when I someone said, "It sounds like narcissism," and I started to look into that topic, and I discovered narcissistic abuse is invisible abuse if you've grown up with it. If you've grown up with people who wouldn't allow you to have boundaries, then it feels normal in another relationship to not have your own boundaries and to let your boundaries be where they want them to be. For example, having a narcissistic family sets you up for a narcissistic partner, um, but you'll find yourself alone in the relationship because because they're not able to feel with you and they're not feeling with you. Um, but it can feel great. It can feel great for a long time. They can mirror because they can join you in your positive energy. I was in a positive energy most of the time, so it worked out most of the time. If I had been able to be in a happy energy 100% of the time, maybe we wouldn't have nothing would have happened. But it's not humanly possible, and so
Mm.
so the triggers did happen. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
That's really interesting. And when you think about narcissism, what do you really want people to know? What do you feel like people get wrong when they think about narcissism?
Well, for one, I'm not suggesting anyone should accept abuse. If you're But here's the thing: narcissistic abuse is usually unrecognized. Usually, the partner is just feeling like I'm, not very good. I'm because they're trying to make you feel like you're lucky to have them, and they might do that by making you feel bad about yourself, and you don't realize that's abuse. If your partner's making you feel bad about yourself intentionally, that's abuse. It's invisible abuse if you're used to it. But you shouldn't be accepting it. And that's where boundaries come in, healthy boundaries. But when it's already too late to put up the boundaries, it causes it's going to cause a lot of disruption. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't value yourself. If you are with someone who constantly needs validation, and you're not being validated in return, stop and think about that, and if it's okay in the long term for you, if that's really what you want your life to look like. If someone's not able to have a growth mindset, then they're not going to have any change. We all need to live with a growth mindset, honestly. The world is an anxious and depressing place right now. We all need a growth mindset because we naturally go towards fear. And that's certainly what happens with the narcissism. It when they're alone in their thoughts, they're going in the direction of fear. And that's where our thoughts do go when we're all alone in them.
That's so interesting, because two things that you said really stood out to me is, one, we don't know what's normal because we only have our own experience, our own family experience, even the early relationships that we entered into, whether it's a caregiver child relationship or an early romantic relationship. Everything is subjective because it's based upon our own experience, and we don't have an expert lens into the details of other people's families and lives. We only know our own lives. And so it can be really easy to fall into this cycle of abuse, or as you said, silent abuse, where you don't realize that you are in a relationship, a toxic relationship that's harming you, that's not normal, that's not normal is a really challenging word, but that is not positive, that's not conducive with your dreams or your goals, and is not going to end up well over the long term. I really appreciate you being able to bring up this topic, to be able to unpack it with us, to let me ask 1,000 questions. Where can people go to learn more about you, your work with narcissism, and all the cool stuff that you're up to?
They can visit coachingfornarcissism.com. If they go there, they'll find all my social medias. And on my social media, I am educating about what narcissism is and how it looks like on the inside. I'm creating some unique things over there. It's an attempt to help people awaken to what's happening for them, and to understand that whatever is happening for you is a human experience, whatever that is, whether it's narcissism, whether it's borderline, doesn't matter. Whatever is happening to you is a human experience that you should not be ashamed of. You're having it because you're a human, and reaching for support to feel better and to have better relationships is really healthy. I know there's a stigma. There's been a stigma about mental health, but mental health is health. It's just, and it's incredibly important health, because it actually manages your mood, and so much it's the life you create depends on your mental health. So it matters a lot. We'd go to a cardiologist for our heart. Why wouldn't we go to someone for our mental health? It matters. How you feel matters, and how the people around you feel matters, because we are better together.
Absolutely. Well, Darren, it has been such an absolute pleasure talking with you. Listeners, watchers, I'm going to provide links for his website and social handles in the show notes and description box for this video or podcast, wherever you are watching it. Listen, y'all, this narcissism thing, it is real, but it's also more common than you think. And with helpful resources and people who can provide therapy like Darren, it's also treatable. We'll see you on the next episode. This episode of Treatable was edited by Daniel Lopez. The intro and explanatory sections of the episode were written by Alexandra Kruger. The theme song was created by Sebastian Gonzalez, and the cover art for this episode was created by Joel Daniel. If you got any value from this episode, it would personally mean the world to me if you would leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. It helps to spread mental health awareness to more folks, and I read each and every comment that people leave. So tell us what you appreciate about the podcast, and you just might hear us feature it on the next episode. All of my love, and we'll see you on the next one.